Hi, welcome back to Coding Games in Python. In this video we'll talk about animated sprites, how to make a sprite look left and right. So let me kind of show you what we want to be able to do here. Okay, so let me show you the demo. Okay, here's a sprite. If I move forward, it's going to look right. If I go left, it's going to look left. So it's pretty simple, but we can use the sprite to kind of allow us to orient it differently. Okay, let's go back to the lecture. So in one of the previous video, we talked about sprite objects have only one image. We have one image, and we can use one image to kind of move it around. Everything is very static. But as we just saw in some games, a character sometimes when we animate a character, we can use many images, also known as textures. For example, if someone is walking across the screen, we want to have different images for walking left, walking right, different poses, standing facing left, standing facing right, etc. And so we want to be able to incorporate more than one image in a sprite. So here's some common types of sprites in games. I mean, the simplest sprite object is the one that has one image, a static one. But the one after that would be something that has more than one image. It would be just something that has two images, one face left, one face right. So that's kind of one of the simplest one to work with. So we're going to talk about this in this video. Then in the next few videos, we'll talk about how to do a more complicated sprite, like a time sprite, which is where you have a set of images or textures for a sprite that is drawn in order and is drawn at a specified time interval. For example, you have a list of images, and we draw it every 5 frames, or every other frame, or whatever it is. And a good example of a time sprite is an explosion sprite, because we have a set of images that simulate an explosion, and we just draw them at a certain time interval so that we can finish the whole explosion in, say, half a second. Another type of sprite is called walking sprite, and it's very similar to a time sprite, except that we're going to draw the images or the textures in order, but at a specified distance interval instead of time interval. So for example, every 5 pixel. So you have a character moving across the screen every 5 pixel that he's walking. We want to change his pose or his image so that we can simulate him a very realistic movement. And so these are the walking characters. So we go to all of these, but in this first one we do something simple and talk about how to do a facing sprite. But everything we do in this video will kind of set the material for the rest of the next 2 videos. Okay, so let's go back to the Sprite class. In the previous video, we talked about all these attributes that help us work with sprites. But now we want to talk about more attributes. So here are 2 more attributes that is helpful in the Sprite class. So every time we have an image in Arcade, an image can be loaded into an object called texture class. And so a Sprite class has a couple of attributes that are helpful. One of them is called the texture attribute. And so a sprite object has a current texture that's supposed to be drawn in the current frame. That's the texture attribute, as well as also the same sprite object may have many images that can choose from to be drawn. So the textures with an S is a list of texture object, and whereas texture without the S is the current texture that we want to draw in the current frame. So to create a texture object in Arcade, we just call the load texture. So arcade.load texture, and then we send over an image. So take this image, create a texture object, and then store it into the texture variable, for example. Okay, so again, the texture variable is the current texture or the current image that we want to draw for this sprite. Again, this is the texture that is drawn in the current frame when we call the draw method on the sprite. It will draw that texture. In fact, when we create the when we use this code to create a sprite object, arcade.sprite, and then we send over the name of the variable and then the scaling, and then this will return the sprite object. What this code does actually is that it sets the current texture to be exactly this image, and then it creates a list of exactly one image, and that image is exactly the same tank image. So that's actually what goes behind the screen when we create a sprite object. And so textures is the list of all images for this sprite object. So for example, an explosion sprite object, we have a list of textures or images representing various phases of the explosion. And so we can cycle through this list of images, and we keep setting the texture to be each of those texture, and then those will get drawn at every frame. So for example, I can set the current texture that needs to be drawn to be the first texture from my list of textures, for example. Okay, set texture is a method that is just a convenient method. It basically just works with texture and textures. So it takes an integer index, and set the current texture to be exactly the texture from the list of textures given by index. And so for example, in the previous code, when we want to set the first image or texture from the textures list to be the current texture, we could also have done it another way using the set texture. So for example, if I say self.setTexture with the index 0, that means I want the current texture to be the one that position 0 from the textures list. Okay, so we're going to do a quick example. This is an example of a character facing left and right. So okay, let me exit the screen here. Okay. Alright, so we're gonna we have two files here, the left right, the main game window file, and then the objects file where we can create our tank object, which is a subclass of the sprite object. Okay, so let's just create the tank class first. So this one, normally when we create a sprite, we need a file name and a scaling. That's how we usually do it in the previous videos. But this time, because we have more than one images, we don't want to send over one file name. So we're gonna just do the default init call to the Sprite class to initialize some variables. Then we're gonna actually load all the images here in the constructor of the tank class. And so I want to load a texture. This is a temporary texture. So rk.load texture, and so I need to send over an image. So if I look at my images list, this is the tank left and tank right. So let's set the images to be tank right. So let's set this the default direction to be facing right. So I can set the scaling here too, but actually no, this is we'll load the texture first, and then I can add this to my textures list. So this is create a temporal texture object, and then I'll add it to my textures attribute. So again, this is the attribute that we talked about earlier. This is the attribute in the Sprite class that we're inheriting. And I want to do this again because I have two images. So now if you have more than two images, then you can do a for loop, but in this case let's do it manually. So now I want to load the left image to create the texture object out of that, and then also add it to the same textures list. Okay, so I've just initialized my list to be so now this sprite object has two images rather than one that we're used to. Then we need to also set the default texture. So again, self.texture, this is the texture that will be drawn when I call the draw method. So let's set that to be the first one, which is facing right. So bracket 0, that's the first one, which is the one facing right. And then if I want a second one, it'll be the one facing left, and I put a 1 here. So let's put 0 for the one facing right. So that's the default. So notice, right, this texture is a temporary texture, but this is actually the attribute texture because of the self dot here. Again, as in the lecture, we also could have done this another way. We can also call set texture and send over the index. So if I say 0 here, so this is the same as this. Right? So two ways of doing that. So I'll comment this up. Okay, and so that will initialize my my tank to be facing right initially, and then I can in the update, I want to call the update of the sprite class. Again, this will make me move, right? This will add change x, change y, right, to center x, center y, etc. But I also want to, besides updating, moving it, we also want to figure out where we're facing based on our speed. So if my change x is positive, meaning if I'm going right, then I need to set my texture to be facing right, which is 0. And then if my x velocity is negative, that means I'm going left, then I need to set the texture to be the texture that faces left. So that's it. That's basically all I need to do to get this tank to work. So let's go back to the main file here. Let's create a player, and let's just take the constructor is just the constructor without any variable, and then this will load all the textures for me. And then I want to set the player center X to be where we can see it. So let's say 200, center Y, say 300. And then I can draw the player. I can update the player. I also have code here from the previous video that can help me move my player based on my key press. Yeah, so that's basically, let's just run this, see if that works. Okay, that's it. So that's pretty easy here. Okay, so this is kind of the simplest example of an animated sprite. In the next video, we'll talk about how to do a time sprite, which is, for example, we'll learn how to do explosion when we shoot someone and we want to have explosion. Okay, thanks for watching.